You think destruction is loud. You imagine armies, crumbling stone, a final blow delivered in a moment that makes history and headline. That is the child's picture of power, fireworks and swords, and a single triumphant shout. Here's the thing. Most ruin arrives like erosion, patient, invisible, polite. The wind that moves sand grain by grain until a canyon is formed feels nothing, and yet leaves everything different. If you want to see how empires die, don't watch battle. Watch the way people stop believing in them. Watch the way confidence evaporates. Watch how a kingdom erodes not because someone attacked its walls, but because someone eroded its story. There is a quiet cruelty in that. It's not heroic. It is intimate. It is surgical with its silence. A man who sits across from you and never raises his voice might be setting the terms for your surrender just as effectively as a man who stands on a podium and shouts. The most terrible moves are the ones that require no violence at all. They require only attention and the willingness to see other humans as material, impressions to be shaped, reputations to be recalibrated, expectations to be rearranged. That kind of work is both an art and a confession, and it stains. Machiavelli doesn't hand you a list of weapons. What he hands you is a mirror with the sharp edge of a question. What are you willing to become to preserve what you love? People read that and choose their answers, sometimes with courage, sometimes with caution, sometimes with cruelty. What I'm offering here is not a handbook for dismantling a person. This is a story about how that dismantling looks and what it costs the one who pulls the thread, the one who watches the house unravel because they tugged on the wrong seam. There is a moment in every life when the map you've been following stops matching the territory. You grow up believing in certain story. That honesty is rewarded. That reputation can be kept pristine if you only keep your hands clean. That power is a clean thing when it belongs to you. Then you learn that stories are fragile. They are myths we stitch together so we can move through the world without tripping over the sharp edges of reality. When someone else is invested in a competing myth, when their version of you threatens your version of truth, you are given a dilemma. Defend the myth or destroy the myth. Both options carry consequences. Both change the map. Destroying a myth is different from destroying a person. The myth is a public shape, what people think you are, what they trust in you for, the assumptions they make when you walk into a room. To touch it is to touch everything the person has built on top of it. To unravel someone's myth is to rearrange the stage on which their life is performed. It is to make their gestures no longer read the same way. That is not always violent. It is often clinical. A failing myth can make a man shrink. It can make a leader stumble. It can make an empire seem small overnight. I watched it once, from inside a room that smelled of coffee and old leather and impatience. Two people sat opposite each other as if they were negotiating a price, but they were negotiating more than a figure. They were negotiating a future. One of them had always relied on a particular kind of story. Competence, generosity, a public face that forgave mistakes because there was always the bigger narrative of greatness behind it. The other wasn't using fire and swords. He used questions, reminders, small public shifts in the conversation that made others look again. He did not shout. He asked a series of polite, precise questions in public and let silence carry the answers. He didn't call people liars. He allowed them the dignity of making their own mistakes, then made those mistakes mean something different. What happened next wasn't a spectacle. It was a slow reorientation. The crowd that had once leaned forward in curiosity now sat back in doubt. The longer the silence went on, the more room there was to imagine absence. People filled that absence with stories. They made the worst version of what might be true more believable than the best. Narrative is a greedy thing. It will eat any gap to stay alive. The man who had never raised his voice watched as those gaps formed, and before anyone noticed, the shape of the other man's power had been altered. It was as if someone had redrawn the lines on a map. The rivers still ran, the mountains remained, but the roads had been rerouted in ways that made travel awkward, slow, unreliable. This is the anatomy of reputational collapse, not a single blow, but a series of reattribution. An offhand remark becomes a pattern, a falter becomes proof. The mind is lazy about history. It prefers tidy threads. When presented with one, it stitches. The stitch might be unfair, disproportionate, dishonest, but it is efficient. That efficiency is what destroys. So when someone wants to destroy another's hold without ever attacking, they don't need to attack. They simply need to arrange the conditions for the stitch to look like the only sensible way forward. Don't hear me saying this is clever and clean. It's not. It is a dirty work done with ink and silence and the patient repetition of small things. It leaves traces. It asks you to keep your conscience in your pocket while you work. And here is the critical part. The person who pulls the threads must be ready for what the new fabric will look like. Power reconstitutes itself. Where one person is undone, someone else will read the pattern and step into the vacant role. The world does not like holes, it manufactures placeholder. There is also the matter of cause and consequence. People who have been undone will often find new ground, radical, bitter, clarifying. They will reinvent themselves as survivors. That reinvention sometimes makes them wiser, sometimes more dangerous, sometimes quieter. The moral of this is not that destruction is final. It is that destruction is catalytic. If you trigger an undoing, you are not simply cutting off a branch. You are altering the ecosystem of relationships, loyalties, and habits that circled that branch. Trees lean differently after a windstorm. So do people. You asked, perhaps only in your head, for the method. You wanted steps, formulas, the recipe that makes things fall apart without a hand ever reaching out to push them. Let me be blunt. That is the kind of knowledge that seduces and corrupts, but understanding is different from instruction. So listen, the real instruments are always ordinary things. Silence, timing, repetition, attention, and sometimes the small cruelty of letting an assumption persist until it becomes accepted. That means the weapon is often a refusal to explain, a refusal to correct, a refusal to amplify, a refusal to respond. But that's not a manual. That's an observation about the human mind's hunger for narrative closure. If you go beyond that observation and start plotting to weaponize people's vulnerabilities, I won't help. What I can do is tell you a story about a person who tried to be both surgeon and sinner, who thought he could cut out a rot without staining his own hands. He convinced himself that he was doing something noble, protecting a family, preserving an institution, or restoring balance. The first time you tell yourself that, your reasons feel clean. Motivation becomes a wreath that covers the sharpness of your action. You believe the ends justify the means, and the brain, remarkably accommodating, rewrites the past to suit the present. He was methodical, not because he was cruel, but because he was terrified. So he learned to calibrate. He watched for the hinge of someone's identity, a story they repeated, a habit they relied on, an achievement they leaned on when tides turned. He did not need to invent falsehoods. He merely had to shift the light so those details caught a different shadow. People would then look, and their eyes would import meaning. It's not necessary to hand them a gun if you can hand them a mirror that shows them as small. Through this man's eyes you see how seductive the unraveling is. He would sit at the edge of a cafe, listening to other people's casual condemnations like a priest collecting prayers. He learned which memories carried weight and which could be ignored. He discovered that when you refuse to contradict gossip, gossip grows polite in the daylight and malignant by night. And he savored success in a way that made him ashamed afterward. He told himself he had saved something important, but in the silence later, there was a taste of iron. There is a pivot in the tale where the executor becomes the executed, not by a blade, but by the recoil of his own moral physics. Every action sets up a gravity. You pull a string and the room moves, but that motion also tugs at your hand. He begins to notice that the same mechanisms he used outwardly were at work inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about his maneuver. He saw possible slights in neutral faces. He misread kindness for strategy, generosity for calculation. He trained himself to expect betrayal, and in doing so made himself less trustworthy. His relationships deteriorated not because others were worse, but because his own shadow stretched across them and made warm things cool. This is always the danger of power that is practiced as a craft rather than a responsibility. It narrows the soul. You start to measure people as risks and assets. You catalog friends as liabilities. You notice the cost-benefit of every conversation. Your emotional world becomes a ledger, and ledgers are brutal. They count what you have lost, and they don't include the price you are paying to be right. It would be easy here to write the antihero's logical self-defense, the speech where he justifies everything with a noble lie. It is harder to show the small, ruinous compromise, a thought unspoken, an apology withheld, a laugh that never arrives. The thing about psychological ruin is it doesn't always leave corpses. It leaves actors, people who play parts badly, who forget how to be spontaneous, who are always performing anxiety. The man who aimed to destroy reputations ends up wearing a reputation of paranoia. And then the world does what the world always does. It mirrors you back. A rival, perhaps more ruthless, perhaps only more patient, notices the wear and decides that an opening exists. The tactics you used become the tactics used against you. People in glass houses throw stones. They also learn that stones will eventually come back. He finds himself on the receiving end of the very quiet devastations he once curated. The irony tastes bitter but exact. It does not absolve him, doesn't absolve the harm he caused, but the reciprocity is telling. Damage begets damage because systems are symmetrical in their capacity to be operated upon. There is, despite this, a darker moral. Consequences don't always arrive on schedule, and they rarely announce themselves with fanfare. Harms can reach across years. A life built on the manipulation of meaning cannot help but become metastatic. What started as a plan to protect becomes a pattern to repeat. The man who thought he could construct order through omission ends up in a house that only speaks in conditional sentences. He wonders at the end whether the person he destroyed ever existed in the way he thought, whether our myths are, in the end, collaborative inventions we all share the duty to sustain. And yet there is a redemption of sorts, not a tidy absolution but a hard, clarifying moment. He sits by a window and realizes that for everything he set in motion, the only real power left to him is to stop. He can't undo the past. No apology erases a rumor. No confession rebuilds a trust that has calcified into suspicion. But cessation is a kind of contrition. He chooses to stop the machinery because the machinery's cost has become too visible. He chooses silence not as an instrument anymore, but as a refusal to continue harming. That is not heroic in a cinematic way. It is quieter. It is the last act of a person who finally sees the kinetic energy he has been feeding his life into. This is the point you must not mistake. Power exercised without moral constraint is self-diminishing. It wins battles and loses souls. Destruction travels outward and then, inevitably, inward. If your aim is to destroy anyone because you feel threatened, the truth is that what you will most certainly destroy is yourself first. Your patience, your trust, your capacity to accept others as people rather than problem. We are not designed to be living instruments of damage. We are designed for messy human things. Care, repair, stubborn routine, the small mercy of showing up. Trade those for a recipe of slow ruin and you will find that you have paid an enormous price for something you will never be able to enjoy. Still, you might ask, is there a way to protect yourself without becoming what you fear? There is. It is not glamorous. It is not Machiavellian in the cruel sense. It is simple, brutal, and honest. Name boundaries, speak truth when it matters, live where you can see your hands. Build institutions that survive the temptation of small cruelties because they are transparent and accountable. Cultivate people who will tell you when you are wrong, not manipulators who will reflect your biases, but people who will risk your ire to keep you human. These things do not ensure victory, they ensure continuity. And here is the final, ugly lesson. Human beings do not collapse because someone planned it perfectly. They collapse because they stop being witnessed. Public life is reciprocal. It feeds on attention. If you want to undermine a power, you can starve it by changing the flow of attention. That's the observation I made earlier. But if you do that, you must accept that you have rearranged the moral economy of others' lives. The question you have to answer is whether your rearrangement leaves more room for life or simply substitutes one hollow center for another. Our cautionary man learns this the hard way. After the dust settles, after the public whispers and the quiet reckoning, after the obvious winners have moved on, he sits with the cost. He discovers that the person he wanted to vanquish has, in the margins, created new meaning. That meaning, raw and real, sits there like a wound that has become a new entrant. People he did not expect come to that person's side, not because of strategy, but because human beings prefer truth that hurts less than suspicion that thrives. In other words, charisma and goodwill are stubborn things. They reappear even when you have tried to erase them. If you want a final image, picture two men in a room much later, the first one touched by a dozen small regrets, the second resurrected into a life that resembles something like peace. The second man has scars, the first man has instruments that no longer make sense. They look at each other, and there is no triumphant moment. There is the dull recognition of what each has become. There's a handshake that is too formal. There's an apology that is asymmetric. You feel the moral weight shift, not like a punishment meted out by fate, but like the natural settling of a house that has been shaken. I tell you this not to be sentimental. I tell you this because power is an ecosystem, and ecosystems are not moral or immoral. They are descriptive. What matters is the human cost you are willing to bear. If you insist on operating under the logic that the world has to be won at the expense of others' lives, ask yourself, will the world you've won be worth living in? Will the victories still taste like victory when your own laughter is gone? When you have turned every conversation into a ledger and every person into a calculation, what remains for tenderness? There is also a courage in choosing to be ordinary in the face of extraordinary temptation. There is a stubborn grace in deciding to preserve the possibility of trust. That preservation is radical in a landscape where reputation can be curated and weaponized. To choose not to curate others' collapse is, in some ways, an act of power more difficult than demolition. It requires you to be vulnerable when you could be strategic. It requires you to accept risk without the compensating comfort of controlling everything. He sat up later that night with the taste of the world still in his mouth, not sweetness, not exactly bitterness, but the flattened aftertaste of something once sharp now gone dull. There is a particular kind of silence that follows long campaigns of indirection. It is not empty so much as full of the small things you didn't say. He went back through conversations like a man reading his own handwriting after a fever, noting where he had let a sentence hang, where he had allowed a rumor to ferment by not noticing it, where he had chosen technique over tenderness. Memory is a ledger only until you feel it in your hands. Then it becomes a confession. He discovered in the slow math of nights that remorse is less a dramatic revelation than an accumulation. It is the sum of tiny recoils, a laugh that felt like an assessment, a touch that was measured, a call he didn't make because he worried his curiosity would be interpreted as weakness. Those small debts compound. They become heavier than any single overt sin. The more he examined himself, the more he saw how his life had been arranged around avoidance. He had avoided humiliation by preempting others. He had avoided chaos by orchestrating it elsewhere. He had avoided love by inventing policy. Policies are useful. They are rules that reduce harm because they are predictable. But rule-bound living can become a kind of botched honesty. You check the boxes of virtue and assume you are virtuous. That assumption can be the beginning of arrogance. And arrogance, when it is quiet and clever, is the hardest thing to feel growing. It creeps up between good deeds. It hides in charity given with a ledger attached. Then there were the people. You cannot pull at webs in a room and not feel the strands vibrate under your fingers. He had people in his life who loved him imperfectly, people who stayed because they saw the good in him even when he didn't. He had allies who had forgiven him for small cruelties because they believed in his larger project. He had enemies who taught him by reflection what not to become. All of them mattered. He had assumed that people were replaceable if the end was right, that public victory excused private vacancy. That assumption revealed itself as a lie when he opened his phone and found it lighter than he expected, when party invitations dwindled, when the friend who used to call simply stopped answering. His network had not evaporated because people were ungrateful. It had thinned because trust is not just a function of what you can do for someone, but of how you make them feel while you do it. You can pay the bill and still be bankrupt inside. This collapse of intimacy was the sharpest cut. It taught him an inconvenient lesson. Influence without affection is an architecture without occupant. Buildings can be impressive in photographs, but an empty house is a museum of loss. He began to see the world as a field of inhabited places, some warm and overflowing and messy, some austere and efficient and cold. Both arrangements can be successful in a measurable sense. What he could not measure was the tenderness that evaporated when efficiency became a supreme value. He had prioritized outcomes and in doing so, sacrificed the messy currency of being present. Presence is not heroic, it is habitual. It is the friend who shows up when you are sick, the partner who listens without solving, the sibling who remembers your birthday without a calendar. Those small acts are not strategic, they are human. And yet, despite the losses, despite the growing discomfort of his inner life, something else uncoiled in him, not vindication but humility. Humility is a practical thing. It is not about diminishing yourself, but about making room. He learned how to make room by listening in a way that wasn't preparation for his next move, by asking questions that did not plan to use the answers. This listening did not feel like weakness. Felt like returning from a war to find that war is not the best place to live. There is courage in choosing the ordinary because ordinary is where reparations are possible. Ordinary includes showing up, apologizing, and repairing without spectacle. He practiced these small acts like a muscle he hadn't used in years, making coffee for another person without attaching a motive, returning a call late with an honest, "I'm sorry I left you waiting," admitting when he didn't understand. They were humbling. They were also transformative. What changed most was his relationship to narrative, where he had once used story as a weapon to shape perception, to chisel away at another's myth. He now tried to use story as a scaffold for repair. Stories can be instruments of erasure, yes, but they can also be the way we teach ourselves and others to be better. He began to tell different stories about power, that it is temporary, that it is conditional, that it is given as often as it is taken. He told stories not to dominate, but to soften. He told them to acknowledge his mistakes and to make space for other people's truths. That shift wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with applause. It came slowly, the way new skin forms over an old wound. There is something else in the aftermath of all this, a practical clarity about risk. He stopped asking whether he could destroy someone and started asking how to protect shared life. It is a subtle pivot linguistically, but massive ethically. To move from how do I neutralize threats to how do we sustain what we have requires a change of imagination. He had to imagine a future where multiple people could thrive without needing his permission. That imagination was a kind of democratic act. It meant designing systems, not traps. It meant creating norms that outlast personality. It meant recognizing that the best legacy is not the fall of your enemies, but the flourishing of those who remain. He also discovered that admitting error was not a single grand confessing, but a repeated practice. Apology is not always accepted. Sometimes apology is met with suspicion, sometimes with silence, sometimes with the pragmatic "we'll see." That uncertainty is a fair consequence. People who have been hurt will take their time. Real repair is patient. It is not performative. It involves accountability that is visible and repetitive, making reparation where possible, changing behaviors that were obvious to others long before they were obvious to you, stepping back when you are the problem, stepping forward when you can genuinely help. The ancient rituals of reconciliation are not glamorous, but they are effective because they are built for the long haul. And yet the human world retains its paradoxes. People who have been harmed sometimes become the fiercest advocates for mercy. They refuse to replicate the violence they endured. Others choose the opposite path, harden. Both responses are understandable. The cruel irony is that by unleashing quiet destruction, you are not simply shifting one person from their pedestal. You are creating a moral experiment with unpredictable outcomes. You may harden the person, making them less trusting and more dangerous, or you may break them in ways that lead to clarity and reinvention. You cannot control which. The humility here is not about moral superiority, but about epistemic modesty. You do not, in fact, know what your actions will ultimately create. That unknowability is why the question of whether to act destructively becomes existential. If you decide to harm to prevent harm, you must accept the humility of not controlling the aftermath. You must live with the knowledge that your tidy moral calculus may have been hubris. Some people will call that cowardice. I call it honesty. Honesty in power is rare because power rewards narrative control. The world is designed to reward those who can tell the most convincing story about themselves. It is tempting, as he learned, to believe your own rhetoric. But the soul resists being entirely convinced by its own arguments. The climactic turning point in his life, the one that finally made him stop, was not public. It was private and almost trivial. He found a note he had written but never sent. In it were small, ordinary promises to people he'd loved. He had drafted them confidently, thinking they were insurance policies for relationships. I'll be there for your graduation. I'll call when you travel. I won't let rumors dictate my seeing you. Those promises, unpaid, were the quiet currency of his decline. He realized that reputation management had replaced relationship maintenance, that he had been prioritizing the appearance of fidelity over fidelity itself. That small document, more mundane than dramatic, had the power to undo him more thoroughly than any accusation. Power's seduction, he understood finally, is not the drama of domination but the loneliness of control. Control is expensive emotionally. It breeds vigilance, distrust, and a narrowing of delight. The real cost of being relentless in the name of security is that you lose the ability to be surprised in benevolent ways. Naming is a small, powerful corrective. It converts unconscious pattern into an object you can address. I notice I'm planning my response instead of listening. Saying it aloud dissolved some of the automaticity. People don't need perfect leaders. They need leaders who notice when they're wrong and adjust. That humility became his most valuable strategy. It diffused conflicts before they hardened. It invited others to mirror his willingness to change. And it reminded him constantly that the work of living with people is repair, not conquest. There were practical lessons, too, that he could now describe without shame. Public life must be accountable, not theatrical. Organizations survive better when they have clear norms about how to handle rumors, mistakes, and power imbalances. The temptation to fix everything privately, to silence, to trade favors for loyalty, to keep scandals off the record, is always present because secrecy is efficient in the short run. But secrecy breeds rot. He learned to encourage transparency, not performative transparency that only looks good, but structured openness that allows others to see the mechanics of decisions and to hold leaders accountable. That structural humility protected communities from individual hubris and made betrayal less profitable. It didn't eliminate conflict, but it made conflict solvable rather than terminal. On a human scale, he cultivated a practice of restorative confrontation. Instead of cornering someone publicly, he chose private curiosity. Instead of amplifying gossip, he asked questions that invited contact. When harm occurred, he insisted on repair that was visible and specific. Name the harm, own it. Make amends that address the actual damage. This practice dismantled the machinery of quiet destruction he had once admired, because it made harm costly in a way that invited correction rather than revenge. People responded to that ethic with a mixture of relief and surprise. Many had assumed that power only served those who learned to weaponize narrative. Seeing a different model felt like air. It would be dishonest to pretend that redemption is a smooth arc. There were scenes of real discomfort, people who refused reconciliation, reputations that could not be rebuilt, friendships that never recovered. He accepted those losses as consequences, not as reasons to return to old designs. Some people would never trust him again, and that was a moral price he would pay. But the alternative, repeating the pattern of quiet erosion, was no longer tolerable. Boundaries were necessary, but their purpose had shifted. They existed not to isolate him from harm, but to protect the vulnerable and to keep him honest. In the small domestic world he valued most, he learned to be less transactional. Love is not an ROI. It is not an asset to be managed. You can't create a balance sheet for tenderness and expect it to balance. He began practicing gratitude instead of strategic generosity. Gratitude is not the same as calculation. It is a way of seeing. It notices when someone shows up without asking what it will cost you later. That noticing is restorative. He found that when he showed appreciation more often without strings, people reciprocated in ways that no ledger could predict. Those reciprocations were not payments, they were life. As his inner world settled, he recognized a final test to his transformation, the temptation to teach others how to be like him in his new form. It is easy to proselytize for humility and restraint. It is another thing to accept that others have their own lessons to learn. He resisted the urge to become a moralist. Instead, he became a companionable witness, sharing what he had learned when asked and modeling it always. The difference matters. Evangelism can become dogma. Companionship is a practice. When you model repair instead of preaching it, you invite rather than coerce. People choose the path because it makes life better, not because it is fashionable. When the moment of public reckoning finally came, not dramatic, not televised, but plain and human, he faced it with the weight of what he'd become. People he had hurt had their say. There were apologies that needed to be heard and reforms that needed to be enacted. He accepted them. He did not deflect or rationalize. He listened, he adjusted. It was a painful season, but it felt honest in a way scandal never did. There was no victor, no vanquished. There was a series of small, costly decisions that collectively moved a community forward. That was victory enough. In the quiet that followed, he sat again at the window with a cup of tea, not to craft another narrative, but to be present to the world he had with effort and error preserved. He felt the relief of not needing to control every contour of human behavior. The relief was not weakness, it was clarity. He realized that influence at its best is a stewardship, a temporary guardianship that must be returned with the house in better condition than you found it. That metaphor kept him honest because houses can be improved. People need to be liberated, not installed. Here's the last thing to hold. People who want to dominate others without openness are always making a bargain. They will gain a kind of security in exchange for intimacy, spontaneity, and trust. That exchange looks profitable on paper but bankrupt in life. The most radical thing you can do with power is refuse that bargain. Refusing doesn't always protect you from harm, but it preserves you for joy, for mistake, for repair. It keeps you capable of surprise and capable of being surprised by goodness. And when you are capable of being surprised by goodness, you are capable of responding to it not as a threat but as a gift. You asked earlier, perhaps silently, what it would mean to destroy someone without attacking them. The answer I offer now is a caution. It's often possible, but it is rarely just. The means leave marks you will carry. The marks alter your view of humanity. The world you make by erasing others will be less interesting, less humane, and ironically, less stable. The better project is harder, to design spaces where people can fall and be helped up, where mistakes are corrected publicly with dignity, where power is used to create more life, not fewer options. That project requires patience, accountability, and a stubborn humility. It does not promise easy wins. It promises instead a life worth living. So if you must choose a path of power, choose the one that leaves room. Choose to be the person who, when tempted to pull a thread that might unravel another, asks instead what it would take to repair the tear. Choose the slower courage of repair over the swifter rush of erasure. That choice won't make you invulnerable, but it will make you more human. And in that humanity, there is a strength that survives far longer than any victory assembled from other people's ruins. He learned finally that the work of living well is less about winning and more about tending. Tending is an ugly, patient verb. It asks for small gestures repeated until change becomes visible. It asks you to answer when someone calls, even when you are tired. It asks you to admit error before you are forced into it. It asks you to make the difficult kinds of promises and then to keep them. The quiet daily fidelity to those acts builds something sturdier than any reputation sculpted by omission or manipulation. That sturdiness is not glamorous, but it is real. It holds when storms come. That holding is a mark of character more reliable than applause. Here's the thing. You can be powerful and generous at the same time, but that requires vigilance of a different kind. Instead of vigilantly pruning others for perceived threats, you must vigilantly prune the impulses in yourself that tempt you toward cruelty disguised as prudence. The tests will come: small betrayals, big slights, the slow grinding of disagreements into grudges. How you respond to those tests is the measure of what you've built inside. Do you double down on tactics that hollow you out, or do you practice repair even when it costs you advantage? The most useful skill he developed was not cunning but restraint, not manipulation but steadiness. Restraint allows you to see possibility where your fear would have seen only threat. There is an ordinary heroism in refusing to weaponize narrative. It looks like staying in a relationship when it's hard, or defending someone whose name has been dragged through rumor, or stepping down from an impossible fight because the cost is other people's lives. Those acts don't make headlines. They make neighborhoods. They build companies that can outlast charismatic founders. They produce friendships that resist collapse. The person who holds himself to that standard is more useful in the long run than the person who wins every skirmish and loses everything that mattered to them. When he imagined legacy as a ledger, victories tallied, enemies neutralized, he bought into a shallow metric. Legacy, he learned, is more like a climate. It changes slowly and affects everything that grows inside it. A climate of suspicion leaves people small and reactive. A climate of trust enlarges behavior to include generosity, risk-taking, and creativity. He chose, after much hard thinking, to influence climate rather than outcome. That meant giving up the illusion of total control. It meant sponsoring institutions and norms that would survive his death, not monuments that only looked good in a photograph. He invested in systems that made it harder for a single person's ambition to wreck the lives of many. Still, reality is koan-like. You cannot fully protect yourself and others from harm without making some hard decision. He learned to distinguish between cruelty and necessary firmness. There are moments when you must be resolute, to refuse access to those who will harm the vulnerable, to enforce boundaries that protect children or workers, to call out behavior that corrodes the fabric of a community. Those acts are not destructive in the poisonous sense, they are protective. The difference lies in intention and follow-through. Protective firmness aims to restore safety. Destructive cunning aims to win at the expense of others' dignity. Keep that distinction sharp. Let it be your moral compass when the easy options of manipulation gleam like stainless knives. The last great change for him was how he spoke about power to others. Instead of teaching tactics for control, he taught language for repair. He told younger people the uncomfortable truth. Influence without accountability will shrink your life, not expand it. He taught them rituals that mattered, how to apologize well, how to listen without preparing your rebuttal, how to make institutions where disputes are handled openly and properly. He taught them that humility is not weakness, but the only reliable basis for durable power. That message was unpopular in some circle because it refused the immediate seduction of zero-sum triumph. But it resonated where it mattered, in quiet families, in classrooms, in organizations that lasted more than one charismatic leader's tenure. And then in the end, he arrived at a small public moment that felt like a test and a conclusion. There was no grand tribunal, no dramatic unmasking. Instead, there was a town hall of sorts, not televised, with people who had been affected, some hurt, some forgiving, some skeptical. He sat at the front and listened. He answered questions without sidestepping. He admitted that his earlier methods caused pain. He showed what he had changed in practice, not just in rhetoric. He offered restitution where it was possible. He did not ask for forgiveness, he asked for a chance to prove change. The asking itself was pivotal. He could have engineered a narrative where he emerged a victim of misinterpretation. He did not. He chose transparency and accountability. That choice did not erase pain. It shifted the energy of the room toward repair rather than spectacle. People left with messy but tangible ways to move forward. That outcome, mundane as it was, felt like more than vindication. It felt like a reconstitution of trust. If you feel, after all of this, tempted to return to the original question, how to destroy someone without attacking them, remember this. It is always possible in a technical sense. But the ethical ledger does not simply record acts. It records the shape of the life you live. You can engineer other people's downfalls, but you cannot engineer the time it takes to carry your own injuries. Those injuries are paid for in the hours you cannot get back, in the relationships that never heal, in the dinners turned quiet, in the hollow trophies in a dark room. If you seek mastery, master the art of restoration. If you seek influence, earn the kind that amplifies the good in people rather than excavating the worst. Imagine now for a moment that you are the gardener and the world is your plot. You can prune and you can poison. Both alter the growth. One tends toward flourishing, the other towards a bare, controlled look that pleases the eye but kills the soil. Which kind of gardener do you want to be? The one who keeps every plant in a pot because it is easier to inspect, or the one who enriches the earth and trusts that diversity will protect the plot from single failure? The second requires risk and patience. It yields a different kind of beauty. Messy, resilient, alive. So let this be your closing instruction, brief and blunt. If your impulse is to destroy, pause and translate that energy. Turn the urge for domination into a project of care. Convert your strategic mind into a builder's mind. Use your capacity for planning to design safety, repair, and longevity. Turn your talent for reading people into a skill for helping them become less dangerous and more whole. That is the alchemy of maturity, turning sharpness into shelter. At the end of his life, the man who once thought he could dismantle others without dirtying his hands discovered the simplest, hardest truth. The power that lasts is the one that returns the house to those who live in it better than it found it. The rest, the cunning, the quiet demolitions, the hollow victories, are all interesting in a moral thriller sense but poor in nourishment. They feed ego and starve the heart. If you take one thing from this voice, from this long confession that started as a query about conquest and ended as a plea for repair, let it be this: choose the work that enlarges life. It will cost you pride and require patience. It will not win everywhere. It may sometimes leave you exposed, but it will leave you human. And when you are human, you can still make mistakes and be forgiven. You can still lose and be lifted. You can still, in the quiet of an ordinary night, find yourself at a window with a warm cup of tea, and feel the slow, steady relief of having lived in a way that allowed others to rise. That relief, small and true, is the only victory worth keeping.